Do you see my slides now? This should be fine, right? Great. Thank you so much for having me. So it's really fun to join this conference organized by sort of scholars and thinkers coming from different backgrounds and different domains and different fields. So given Professor Leszek's very beautiful and illuminating talk, the goal of my presentation is very simple and humble. That is, I'm going to try to sort of extend the scope of the discussion in the following two important ways. First, I'm going to try to expand the discussion from the US to the entire world. And I really believe that pretty much every conceptual point Professor Leszek mentioned during his talk applies not only to the US, but also to the entire world or the entire democratic world. So I'm going to try to sort of convey that message by bringing in some original data analysis. So that's item number one. The second goal of my presentation is to again sort of extend the discussion from the relationship between the media and the politics to a broader subset of the society, especially issues around the economy and the public health. So these are the two items I'm going to try to achieve in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Then to do that, I'm going to start with a very simple fact about the relationship between politics and the economy. So let's classify countries around the world based on how democratic each country's political regime is. Okay, and I'm going to do that by using the widely used index of how democratic each country is, created by the Varieties of Democracy Project, or the VDEM project, which is a very famous nonprofit think tank project about the evolution of democracy. Then I'm going to correlate or relate this democracy index to the economic performance of different countries from 2001 to 2019, effectively the past years in the 21st century. Then here's what we already know. That is, a country like China, okay, has been growing much faster than countries like the US or Japan. So this is an obvious fact every one of us already knows. And the US and Japan happen to be much more democratic countries compared to China in terms of pretty much every possible measure of democracy. Then let's expand this analysis from these three countries to the whole world. Then the correlation between these two things turns out to be something like this. That is, the previous negative correlation between democracy and economic growth turns out to be a much more universal and much more global phenomenon during the past 20 years. And this is true across different continents and across different groups of countries created by different development levels and any other sort of reasonable grouping of countries. And the magnitude of this correlation is also really substantial. It's something like a 1 standard deviation increase in this democracy index is associated with about 3 percentage point decline in GDP per year. And this means that if we compare countries similar to China versus countries similar to the US or Japan, then the political difference or political institutional difference between the two groups of countries is about 3 standard deviations in this democracy index. Then this means that the economic growth gap between the two groups of countries is about 8 to 9 percentage point difference in the GDP growth rate, okay, annually and per year, which is a really sort of gigantic effect. Okay. Then if you look at this simple correlation between democracy or the simple negative correlation between democracy and economic growth, you may be worried that this may be a fake correlation or spurious correlation. But it turns out that it's not. And it's possible to sort of bring in additional statistical and econometric techniques to establish that this correlation is actually a real causation and causal effect as well. And democracy is indeed one of the real causes of this struggling and worse economic performance of democratic countries. And I wrote one academic paper that shows that point in a statistical way. And the national newspaper by the Chinese government picked it up and interpreted it as providing evidence that democracy is a dangerous political institution. But that's not really our intention. And our intention here is to sort of simply neutrally show that, okay, democracy is a real cause of worse economic performance in the past 20 years. Then this thing, which I'd like to call something like the new divergence in the 21st century, is a fairly new phenomenon, historically speaking. That is, if we look at the relationship between political institutions and economic growth in the previous centuries, okay, or up until 2000, okay, then there was no negative correlation like what we saw in the previous figure. And here, I divide the whole world into two groups of countries, okay, above median democratic countries, okay, versus less democratic countries. Then if we look at the evolution of the economic growth rate for each one of the two groups of countries, then before 2000, there was no difference between the two. Or if we look at the per capita GDP growth rate, then democratic countries were growing faster than non-democratic countries. And note that these democratic countries like the US and Japan are already sort of richer countries compared to most of the non-democratic countries. So before 2000 or in the 20th century, the world was very simple. And as the world was following the golden rule of capitalism effectively. That is, as the Great Gatsby puts, one thing is sure and nothing is more sure. That is, the rich get richer. Okay, that's the rule of the game. Okay, until 2000. But around the turn of the 21st century, okay, some fundamental change happened. And since then, okay, this blue line corresponding to sort of non-democracies started consistently or stably dominating the red line of democratic countries. Okay, and in the past 20 years, really sort of almost always non-democratic countries, okay, have been growing faster than democratic countries. Then to sort of more concretely understanding what's going on in this process, let's remind ourselves of key historical events, okay, that happened during this time window. So this great new divergence started around 2000. And this is when the first generation of today's internet platforms started, right? So Google was launched in 1998. Then after that, one big event happened, that is China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And this was a really, really major economic disruption to the global market. And this Chinese participation in the WTO is widely believed to destroy much of the manufacturing industry, both in the US and Japan. Then after that, the second generation of today's internet platforms emerged. Places like YouTube and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, all of these companies started around the same time in the window from 2004 to 2006. Then the next event was the financial crisis, which hit the world in 2008. And in fact, this financial crisis year is when the performance of democratic countries was especially terrible. And the gap between the democratic countries and less democratic countries was historically highest during this financial crisis year of 2008. Then since then, the real crisis of democracy started being widely recognized. The Islamic democratization movement of the Arab Spring started and then immediately failed around 2012. Then the Trump and other populist politicians started emerging across the world, especially in the South and North America, as well as European countries. And then the relationship or the impact of the social media and politics became a really big social issue. Then in 2020, we jumped into this year of the COVID-19. Then what happened during the last year in terms of the performance of democratic versus less democratic countries in terms of their economic performance. It turns out that the relationship between the democracy and economic growth stays almost the same. That is, of course, the average economic growth rate for the entire world was pushed down by about 7 percentage points. That's sort of what we already know. Okay, but in terms of the relationship of the slope between democracy and economic growth, the pattern is remarkably similar to what we saw, okay, in the normal years from 2001 to 2019. To make the problem worse, if we look at the relationship between democracy and the public health outcome, say the number of COVID-19 related deaths per million during the previous year, then the correlation between the two turns out to be massively positive. This means that democratic countries produced more COVID-19 related deaths per million during the previous year. So then this means that during the past 20 years, both in terms of the economic outcome and the public health outcome, and both in the crisis year, like the COVID-19 year or the financial crisis year, as well as normal years, democratic countries have been really consistently and almost always performing worse than non-democratic countries. And that's what I'd like to call the curse of democracy in the 21st century. Then given this descriptive or causal fact, a simple question is probably, why is this the case, right? That is, why do we observe this curse in this century? Then to sort of make progress toward providing some partial answer to this question, the key concept is probably the weakening of democracy, which Professor Lessig already discussed. Then when we talk about this sort of weakening or deterioration of democracy in the past few decades, then we tend to think about a variety of sort of different aspects of this broad concept of democratic weakening. Things from, say, political ideology or opinion polarization to hate speech to populism to things like protective trade policies and so on. So let's try to think about these different aspects, okay, separately and then bring them together into a coherent picture. Then as a starting point, I'd like to think about the case of hate speech as a particular aspect of the broader concept of the weakening of democracy. Then if we look at the evolution of the presence of hate speech in different countries, then we can find the following simple fact. That is, first of all, if we look at the time series evolution of the presence of hate speech in the world and in different countries, the first point to make is that the hate speech increased globally on average, which is probably not surprising. But a more interesting and important fact is that there is a big difference, okay, in the speed of the increase in hate speech between democratic countries and less democratic countries. So in this picture, I again correlate the democracy index, which I already introduced, with the increase in the amount of hate speech conducted by political parties in different countries. Then we find a positive correlation between the two. That is, more democratic countries produced larger increases in hate speech during the past 20 years. And this is for a sort of specific case of hate speech, but it turns out that more or less the same pattern holds for other dimensions of the weakening of democracy as well. That is, things like political polarization, okay, or populist speeches conducted by political parties, or protectionist trade policies and constraints on the freedom to trade, or pretty much any other available measure like the constraints on the freedom to speak up and so on. And this means that, any one of these things, any one of these different measures of the weakening of democracy, is more severe and larger in more democratic countries. So in a sense, in today's world, sort of originally democratic countries are getting less democratic, And originally autocratic and non-democratic countries are getting more and more democratic. And a consequence of this change in the past 20 years is that democratic countries today, okay, are kind of more closed-minded, as illustrated by the previous measures of the quality of democracy. And this closed sort of mindedness of democracies turns out to have important economic consequences or economic impacts as well. That is, if we look at the growth in things like trade and investment in the past 20 years, then there turns out to be a really big difference between democratic countries, okay, and less democratic countries. That is, today's democracies engage in much less trade, relatively speaking, compared to non-democratic countries than before. And similarly, democratic countries engage in less investment into physical capital today compared to a few decades ago. And this means that in today's democracies compared to less democratic countries, okay, they invest in less in physical capital, and they engage in less import, okay? And I don't find any change in the labor input or human labor input. Then if we sort of combine these inputs in the economic production process, then the final output turns out to be going down pretty significantly in democratic countries. And as a result of that, okay, the amount of export also goes down. So this means that in today's democratic countries, okay, across this entire chain of economic production, democratic countries are really struggling compared to other types of non-democratic countries. Then this means that sort of weakened democracy, which Professor sort of Lessig really sort of beautifully explained, okay, is not just contaminating politics and the media, but also is really killing the economy and the people, not only in the US, but also across the world. And this really raises a simple question of then what to do or what not to do to deal with this problem. And I'd like to engage in some additional discussions and conversations about this question and related issues. But thank you so much for your time and attention.